All right, let's jump right into this. Today, we are digging into a really fascinating and I gotta say, pretty provocative article from the Appalachian Gorilla. And it makes a massive claim that the entire foundation of our modern world, well, it's starting to crumble.
See, the author really doesn't pull any punches. This is the huge idea we're going to tackle today. The claim is that the whole system of countries, governments, and borders, the stuff we just kind of take for granted, is fundamentally broken, and maybe even heading for an exit. It's a wild thought.
So before we can even get into whether it's failing, we've got to ask, what exactly is the state model anyway? The whole idea here is that you can't really understand where we are now or where we might be going without first looking at what came before.
To get a handle on the modern state, what the source calls the new boss, we first have to take a look at the old boss. It actually draws a straight line from the days of feudalism right up to today, arguing they're a lot more similar than you might think. You know, for thousands of years, this was pretty much how the world worked. Power wasn't concentrated in some far-off capital city. It was right there, in your backyard. Your whole life was pretty much governed by a local lord who owned the land you lived on and worked.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The author uses this analogy, same idea, new boss. And think about it for a second. Back then, a feudal lord controlled the land, your labor, and even access to loans. And today, the modern state does the exact same things, just with different names, zoning laws, income taxes, and banking regulations. The function of control, it's basically identical.
But here is the absolute key difference that the article hammers home: scale. It's all about scale. The old system was spread out all over the place. Power was personal, it was local. A king was often just, the most powerful guy among a bunch of other local lords, not some all-powerful national government like we have today.
To really let this sink in, let's put some numbers to it. The typical piece of land ruled by one of those feudal lords was about 1,000 acres, okay? Got that number in your head? 1,000.
Ready for this? Even a tiny modern state like Luxembourg is 650,000 acres. That is a mind-blowing consolidation of land and power. We went from literally thousands and thousands of tiny local rulers to just a couple hundred massive centralized states. So how in the world did that happen? Well, the source gives us this kind of whirlwind tour of history. You had plagues that suddenly made workers more valuable. You had treaties that literally drew the lines for modern countries. And you have massive wars that forced power to become more and more centralized. It was a centuries-long process.
Okay, so you have this massive, powerful new system. But what was feeding it? Where did it get its energy? A system that big doesn't just run on its own. The argument is that it has been chugging along on two key ingredients for the past 400 years. And what were those two ingredients? Well, they're surprisingly simple. A whole lot more people and a whole lot of cheap energy. The source claims that this entire system we live in was built on a foundation of massive population growth and tons of easy-to-get oil.
Let's break that down. First, the people part. A constantly growing population means a constantly growing economy and, of course, a bigger tax base. This allowed governments to borrow incredible amounts of money against the future, making big promises and funding huge programs to, well, stay in power. Growth was the engine of politics. And the second pillar, that was the social contract, the trade-off. All that cheap energy created our modern consumer lifestyle. You know, the cars, the cheap goods, what the author calls all the shiny trinkets. The idea is that this material comfort and this feeling of individual freedom made us willing to give up our small, tight-knit local communities for a more centralized, anonymous life. And that brings us right to the core of the author's warning. The whole system is built on these two pillars. But what happens when they start to crack? What happens when the fuel starts to run out?
The article uses a really stark, modern example to make its point about energy: fracking. A fracking well can produce a gusher of oil and gas right at the beginning, but its output can collapse to just a fraction of that in only a couple of years. The author sees this as a perfect symbol for a much bigger problem. We're running out of the cheap and easy energy that built our entire world. And that leads to this pretty blunt conclusion. The energy returns are shrinking, and the system that was built on the idea of infinite growth just can't handle it. The article even suggests that the whole big push for green energy isn't just about the environment, it's a sign that the people in charge know the old gas tank is running on empty. So let's just walk through the author's logic from start to finish. 1. the state makes enormous promises to its people. 2. It pays for those promises with economic growth, which is powered by cheap energy. 3. That source of cheap energy is now getting much harder and more expensive to get. 4. That means the promises can't be kept. And 5. When a system can't deliver on its core promises, it starts to fail.
But look, according to the source, the failure isn't just about resources or economics. There's something much deeper, something more philosophical, a fatal flaw right at the heart of the entire system.
And this is really the gut punch of the whole argument. The ultimate claim is that the state model, by disconnecting us from our local communities, from the land, from each other, it basically asked us to trade away our fundamental human nature in exchange for comfort and safety. And the final verdict here is that this was a deal that was, in the long run, impossible to keep.
So the article leaves us right here, with a pretty heavy diagnosis and a massive unanswered question. If this 400-year-old model that has defined all of our lives is truly coming to an end, the most important question for every single one of us is, what comes next? That's the big question to chew on. Thanks for digging into this with me.